In 1971, twin boys vanished without a trace from their quiet farmhouse while their mother stepped outside for just 15 minutes. No screams, no struggle, only silence and two tiny shoes left by the door. For 20 years, Evelyn Mercer lived in the shadow of that moment, clinging to hope while the world forgot. But on the exact date of their disappearance, a phone rings, and a voice she hasn't heard in 2 decades whispers, "Mom?" What follows is a harrowing unraveling of secrets, a buried cult, and a mother's relentless fight to bring her stolen sons home. It was the kind of overcast September afternoon that wrapped itself around the house like a shroud, the sky swollen with gray, the wind humming low through the trees, and Evelyn Mercer, weary from a morning of chasing after her 3 children and folding endless loads of laundry, stepped outside for what she thought would be no more than a fleeting moment to speak with her neighbor, Mrs. Halbridge, who had come by to complain yet again about the loose board on the back fence that separated their yards, and as she walked a few steps toward the property line with her sleeves rolled up and her boots still wet from the damp grass, she glanced back once, saw the twins, Aidan and Caleb, at the kitchen table, their curly heads bent over a stack of coloring books, their crayons scattered like candy across the tablecloth, and she smiled at the ordinary, familiar mess of motherhood that felt, for all its exhaustion, like the only life she had ever wanted. She stood outside no longer than it takes to explain a simple repair, to nod politely at the neighbors' warnings about coyotes and trespassers, to promise she'd fix the fence tomorrow morning when the rain cleared, and when she turned back toward the house, her hair lifting in a sudden gust and her hands tightening instinctively around her cardigan, something felt different, not wrong, not loud, just subtly, chillingly off. Like the moment before a thunderclap, that long stretch of quiet before the sky tears open, and as she stepped onto the porch and pushed open the door, the silence inside greeted her not as peace, but as absence, the kind of hollow stillness that makes your blood run cold because you know in your bones what should be there. The laughter, the clatter of crayons, the squeak of chairs on tile, is gone, ripped from the moment like a page torn from a book. The kitchen was empty, the chairs overturned slightly as if pushed back in haste, the coloring books left half-finished with a single red crayon rolled onto the floor, and her first thought was that they were hiding, a game, perhaps. But as she called out their names, her voice growing sharper and more urgent with each repetition, and opened closets and peeked under beds and raced from room to room with her heart thudding louder than her footsteps, she began to feel the first tendrils of a fear so primal it made her knees weak and her breast shallow, because there were no signs of play, no mischievous giggles behind curtains or feet poking out from under blankets, just the cold back door swaying slightly open and 2 small sneakers, Caleb's, she was sure, resting on the mat as if he had been told to remove them before going somewhere important. The police arrived quickly, but not quickly enough for a mother whose world was collapsing minute by minute, and though they took statements and brought dogs and searched fields and rivers and neighbors' barns, nothing turned up, not a thread, not a footprint, not even a dropped toy, and the longer the silence stretched, the more the story unraveled in whispers around the town. Maybe she had left them alone longer than she said. Maybe there was trouble in the family she wasn't admitting, maybe, until suspicion replaced sympathy and the flyers with her sons' faces curled under the weight of rain and time, fading into the background noise of tragedy while Evelyn, refusing to leave the house where they had once slept side by side and shared dreams only twins can understand, sat night after night by the window with her eyes locked on the horizon, convinced that if she just waited long enough, if she just held on through the silence, they would come walking back up the drive. Like nothing had ever happened, like time could be undone by a mother's love alone. The years passed like ghosts through Evelyn's house, quiet and uninvited, slipping through cracks in the windows and the gaps beneath the doors, settling into the corners of rooms that once held laughter and light, and though the paint faded, the wallpaper peeled, and the neighbors changed, she remained, rooted like a monument to memory, surrounded by the untouched bedrooms of boys who had vanished without explanation. Their toys preserved like museum pieces, their drawings pinned to the walls like sacred prayers, and every morning she woke with the same ritual, a whisper of their names into the silence, a check on the door locks, a glance out the kitchen window at the backyard where the old swing set, rusted but upright, still creaked in the wind as if some unseen hand nudged it from time to time, and even though the world had stopped asking questions, stopped caring, stopped believing, Evelyn's hope burned on, stubborn and untamable. A low and endless fire in the furnace of her soul. So when the phone rang on the night of September 12, 1991, 2 decades to the day since the twins disappeared. It didn't feel like coincidence or chance or the cruelty of an anonymous call, but something deeper, something cosmic, like the universe had finally taken pity on her unbroken vigil. And as the old rotary phone rang again, its shrill cry slicing through the stillness of the house like a scream through fog, she stood frozen, candlelight flickering across her face, unsure if she was awake, or dreaming, or slipping into some new version of madness born from too many lonely years of waiting. And yet she answered, hand trembling, breath caught in her chest. And on the other end, beneath a blanket of static and distance, came a voice that shattered time itself. "Mom?" the boy said, though it wasn't a boy anymore, not really, but a young man, his voice deeper, weathered, cautious, but still trembling with something raw and familiar. And before she could respond, before she could even trust her own ears, the voice came again, barely louder than a breath. "It's Aiden. They told us you were dead. They never let us call. I didn't know how to find you." And with those words, the world tilted, the decades collapsed in on themselves, and Evelyn sank slowly to her knees, the phone still pressed tightly to her ear, her heart pounding like a drum in a war she thought had ended, her lips forming his name over and over without sound, as if to anchor herself in this impossible moment, to keep from slipping through the cracks of reality. And though she screamed into the line, begged him to stay, to keep talking, to tell her everything, the voice grew distorted, swallowed by waves of interference until it dissolved into a high-pitched whine and then silence, leaving her in a heap on the floor with only the buzzing dial tone and the lingering echo of her son's voice ringing in her ears like the memory of a dream too cruel to be false. She tried to tell the police, to make them see what she had heard, but they dismissed her. A prank call, they said, or wishful thinking, or the cruel tricks of an unwell mind still tangled in grief. And even her remaining family, those few who still spoke to her, advised her gently to let it go, to let the past be past, to stop chasing shadows. But Evelyn couldn't, wouldn't, because she had heard him. And something in her bones, older than instinct, deeper than reason, told her that Aiden was alive and reaching for her from somewhere dark and hidden. And so she went back to the old case files, the fading newspaper clippings, the redacted police reports she'd saved in a box beneath the floorboards, and she began to trace every overlooked detail with fresh eyes, searching for patterns in the noise, for holes in the story, for names that didn't belong, and that was how she found it. The first of the strange threads that would unravel everything, a string of anonymous cash donations made to a children's home in Ohio, always in the same amount, always on the same day each year, signed only with the initials CM, and though no one had ever connected them to the disappearance, Evelyn's pulse quickened, because she had seen those initials before, once, scribbled inside the cover of a book that had belonged to their old neighbor, the one who had moved away just days after the boys were taken. Without notice, without goodbye. It took weeks of dead ends, blurred records, and sleepless nights spent hunched over photocopies and hand-scribbled notes. But Evelyn followed the paper trail that no one else had cared to see, piecing together fragments like shattered glass, names misspelled on forms, children registered without birth certificates, transfers between facilities that didn't exist anymore. Until all the lines pointed to a remote stretch of land in upstate New York, a place so forgotten it barely appeared on the map, a crooked farmhouse set deep behind a wall of trees with no sign, no mailbox, no neighbors in sight. And when she finally arrived, heart pounding so loud she could feel it in her teeth, the place didn't look like a prison or a crime scene or the place where stolen boys might be kept, but like something out of a faded photograph. White paint peeling, a swing hanging limp from a porch beam, flowers growing wild in a garden no one had touched in years, yet the silence there wasn't the kind that calms, it was the kind that watches, that holds its breath as you pass. And when she peered through the windows and saw faces, not her sons yet, not yet, but children, too many, all too quiet, moving in patterns too controlled for comfort, she knew in her marrow that this was it, this was the place that had swallowed them whole. Inside those walls, she would learn later, children had been taken, renamed, reprogrammed, their pasts erased and their futures rewritten by the hands of those who believed themselves prophets or saviors, men and women who called themselves the Order of the Second Dawn, who taught obedience through silence, who beat out memories like dust from rugs, and who had told Aiden and Caleb, now renamed Jonah and Eli, that their mother had died, their past was ash, and their bond as twins was forbidden, severed by design to break them down and rebuild them as something clean and controllable, something the world wouldn't miss. Evelyn didn't wait for court orders or signatures or cautious investigators who demanded paperwork and patience while her son, the one who had escaped with nothing but a torn photograph and the weight of a broken past, led her through the woods and back to the house where he'd been buried alive for 20 years under false names and forced silence, and together they moved like shadows through the trees until they reached that sagging porch once more. This time armed not with fear but with a video camera, with evidence, with the quiet rage of a mother who had nothing left to lose, and what they captured, the locked doors, the numbered children, the hollowed eyes of the forgotten, was enough to spark an avalanche that no law could slow. But even with the building surrounded, even with police peeling back the walls of that nightmare brick by brick, Caleb wasn't ready to leave, not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't remember how to want at all, his memories sealed beneath layers of lies and training and punishment, and it took weeks of patient letters, whispered lullabies, and Aiden's hand pressed gently to his shoulder before something cracked, a blink, a word, a glance, and slowly, piece by piece, Caleb began to remember who he was. Now the farmhouse stands gutted and condemned, yellow tape flapping like torn warning flags in the wind, its windows boarded, its secrets dragged screaming into daylight, but the scars it left behind, not just in Aiden or Caleb but in the dozens of other children taken and reshaped and renamed, remain etched in skin and soul, and though the world has moved on to newer tragedies and louder headlines, Evelyn wakes each morning not in grief anymore but in awe, in quiet gratitude, because both of her sons, older now, strangers in some ways yet unmistakably hers, sit beside her at the table where crayon marks still fade from the surface, trying together to relearn what love sounds like, how to laugh again without guilt, how to speak without fear, how to be a family in the wake of something that tried so hard to erase the very concept. And every September 12th, instead of mourning the day they vanished, they light a single candle in the front window, not for the darkness that swallowed them, but for the voice that broke through it, for the whisper that defied silence, for the boy who ran, the mother who searched, and the miracle of finding each other across the ruins of 20 stolen years. In 1971, twin boys vanished without a trace from their quiet farmhouse while their mother stepped outside for just 15 minutes. No screams, no struggle, only silence and 2 tiny shoes left by the door. For 20 years, Evelyn Mercer lived in the shadow of that moment, clinging to hope while the world forgot. But on the exact date of their disappearance, a phone rings, and a voice she hasn't heard in 2 decades whispers, "Mom?" What follows is a harrowing unraveling of secrets, a buried cult, and a mother's relentless fight to bring her stolen sons home.